Are you genuinely concerned because of this red shadow? Is our nation really endangered by an evil, alien force? The answer is yes. Here is a recent Reader's Digest feature article by General Carlos Romulo, ambassador from the Philippines, past president of the United Nations General Assembly. He sounds a dramatic warning. America, wake up. The editors of the Reader's Digest note, a wise and loyal friend of the United States warns us the Cold War is real war. It is far later than we know. The communists can win without changing their tactics. We cannot win without changing ours. We must assume the offensive. We dare not stand still. Yes, a time has come in the life of our country demanding the fullest citizenship service of every man and woman. The first requirement is an understanding of the true nature of world communism. To accomplish this, we must recall many bits of recent history and assemble them on the map of the world. The 20th century father of communism was Nikolai Lenin. He had a small group of followers completely dedicated to the building of an utterly new, materialistic world ruled by a godless dictatorship. By 1917, they had a force of about 40,000 men, trained in communist revolutionary tactics, and they had infiltrated the socialist government which a few months earlier had gained power from Tsar Nicholas II. At a signal for control of the socialist government. At first, Lenin and his henchmen held only the capital, but by 1922 they had extended their control with the use of infiltration and terror sufficiently to establish the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. Lenin died in 1924, but before he died, he had laid down for his followers the plan for world conquest. Paraphrased and summarized, it declared, first we will take Eastern Europe, next the masses of Asia. Then we shall encircle that last bastion of capitalism, the United States of America. We shall not have to attack. It will fall like an overripe fruit into our hands. No matter who has been the boss in the Kremlin at any time since 1924, the communists have always kept their eyes unwaveringly on this plan and on the strategy to carry it out. This is their blueprint today. The communist strategists have used great patience. Their technique of bit-by-bit advance has been an important key to their success. They have used bribery, lies, bluff, brutality, the most extensive and most successful espionage network in world history, mass murder on a scale never before dreamed of, and every other possible means to advance them along the road to world conquest, following the blueprint laid down by Lenin. Among their greatest assets has been the lack of understanding of the true nature of international communism by the people and the leaders of the United States. The first big break for the communist conspiracy came in 1933, when the United States formally recognized the Stalin regime. The prestige of this recognition was priceless. It enabled the Soviet dictatorship to establish monetary credit and to establish embassies in America and elsewhere as bases of vital espionage operations. This recognition came at a time when Khrushchev was directing the deliberate starvation of millions of Ukrainians who were resisting communist control over their lives. Another stroke of good fortune for the ambitious communist world empire was World War II. Stalin made his notorious deal with Adolf Hitler in August of 1939, and the German panzer divisions rolled into Poland a few days later in September 1939. In just 4 weeks, Russia and Germany were cutting up Poland, dividing the spoils. The Reds made their next move against tiny Finland. The Finns fought courageously, but Moscow got a toehold in the little Baltic nation. Soon thereafter, the Reds infiltrated Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, taking over the three little nations from within. The Baltic people resisted, not in an organized way, but individually. Hundreds of thousands of freedom-loving people were seized, thrown into cattle cars, and sped off to Siberian slave labor camps. The Soviet timetable for conquest was interrupted when Germany turned on the Kremlin and invaded Russia. As Germany drove deep into Russia, the vast numbers of Russian fighting men with American Lend-Lease aid proved a formidable obstacle. Ground strength broke the German armies. But General Patton and other on-rushing Allied forces were halted from going through eastern Germany, Czechoslovakia, and the Balkans by a fateful decision of our governmental leaders. and the stage was set for Stalin's execution of Lenin's master plan, the takeover of Eastern Europe. At the conclusion of the European War, the Soviets returned to their strategy of world conquest through infiltration. The pattern was revealed in Czechoslovakia, but the lesson didn't penetrate the Western mind. All the communists asked of Czech President Beneš was the establishment of a socialist economic system and the placement of a few communists as cabinet officials in a coalition government. One of the cabinet posts occupied by a communist was the Department of Interior, which controlled the police force. At a signal from Moscow, the communists in the government merely asserted full power. Beneš and Jan Masaryk, like countless other Czechs who resisted, were quietly put to death, or they committed suicide. An Associated Press foreign affairs editor wrote this memorable dispatch. Jan Masaryk thought he could do business with communism. His suicide is a monument to his recognition and a warning to the world that no such course is possible. The year was 1948. The warning carries an even greater import today. Czechoslovakia did business with communists. Czechoslovakian freedom was destroyed. One by one, the nations of Eastern Europe fell, from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, East Prussia, and half of Poland already had been seized. Now came the remainder of Poland, plus Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania. First infiltration, then coalition government, then the takeover. The United States and Great Britain stood by, virtually silent and inactive. Our distinguished ambassador to Poland, Arthur Bliss Lane, resigned his post and put on record in his book, I Saw Poland Betrayed, what he had witnessed of communist ruthlessness and the unaccountable behavior of American and British diplomatic leadership. Ambassador Lane wrote, our policy of appeasement toward Soviet Russia undoubtedly emboldened Stalin to go ahead with his plans for the complete domination of Poland, as of all other countries in Eastern Europe. In Western Europe, the communists were content for the time being to aid in the establishment of socialism as a transition stage to communism. It is important that we understand the relationship of socialism to communism. Karl Marx, the founder of communism, was a lifelong socialist. Khrushchev speaks of communism and socialism as very closely related. John Strachey, a top official in the Labor Socialist Party of Great Britain in 1950, was for many years an openly avowed communist. In his book entitled The Theory and Practice of Socialism, he wrote, it is impossible to establish communism as the immediate successor to capitalism. It is accordingly proposed to establish socialism as something which we can put in the place of our present decaying capitalism. Hence, communists work for the establishment of socialism as a necessary transition stage on the road to communism. Further dramatizing the affinity of socialism and communism is this 100th anniversary copy of the Communist Manifesto, published not by Moscow communists, but by the Labor Socialist Party of Great Britain. Yes, socialism and communism are political and ideological bedfellows. Wherever communism can't take over by fomenting internal revolt, the Reds seek to establish so-called democratic socialist governments, which they can infiltrate until the Communist Party can take over. They are working at this in every socialist nation in the world. England and the Western European nations are our allies, and we should respect them and try to generate faith in the good intentions of their people and their governments. However, the documented facts suggest that we should look with penetrating eyes and minds at the socialist activities in Europe, in Scandinavia, and around the world. After the consolidation of their gains in Eastern Europe and their deceptive penetration of Western Europe, the Soviets moved for the takeover of China, the masses of Asia, set forth as the second step in Lenin's blueprint for world conquest. They already had established a powerful communist apparatus in China, headed by Moscow-trained agents. And the concessions gained by Stalin at the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, in the absence of China's leader Chiang Kai-shek, opened the door to their strategic plan. In North China, communist Chinese armies engaged the nationalist armies under Chiang. The actual takeover of China was preceded by a worldwide communist propaganda campaign creating hate for Chiang Kai-shek and picturing Mao Zedong as a great agrarian reformer. Agitation became widespread for a truce in China and for a coalition government. also for a stoppage of U.S. military aid to nationalist China. President Truman sent General George Marshall to urge Chiang Kai-shek to take the communists into a coalition government in China, as President Benesch had so fatally done in Czechoslovakia. Chiang steadfastly refused. General Marshall effected a temporary truce, which in the end aided the communists. Just a few months later, in July 1946, General Marshall halted the sale of arms and ammunition to nationalist China. This was backed up with an executive order by President Truman on August 18, 1946. After the arms embargo went into effect on the forces of Free China, the Chinese Reds moved into military action again, using their excellent Russian-supplied equipment from Manchuria. Some important voices in Congress questioned this tragic turn of events in China, and in the summer of 1947, Secretary of State Marshall and President Truman sent General Albert C. Wedemeyer to China for the announced purpose of making a study to determine whether the United States should rescind its embargo and give aid to Chiang's military forces. General Wedemeyer recommended aiding Chiang. He said that with aid, the nationalist forces could save China from falling into the grasp of international communism. But Wedemeyer's report was suppressed by presidential order. This book was finally published in 1958, after China fell to the communists. Here are the findings of a subsequent investigation by the United States Senate. The Judiciary Committee, in the report it has just issued, finds a conspiracy, communist-inspired, that led to American defeat. High American officials were duped. Policies were influenced that gave the communists their greatest victory. This paragraph says, the loss of China after defeat of Japan represents the greatest defeat in U.S. history. Few Americans read this shocking report, but some political personages were aroused. John F. Kennedy, at the time a congressman from Massachusetts, spoke out, "Over these past few days, we have learned the extent of the disasters befalling China and the United States. Our policy in China has reaped the whirlwind. The continued insistence that aid would not be forthcoming unless a coalition government with the communists was formed was a crippling blow to the national government. This is the tragic story of China, whose freedom we once fought to preserve. What our young men had saved, our diplomats and our president had frittered away." This statement was reported in the February 21st, 1949 Congressional Record. President Kennedy must not forget this speech. In the decade just past, the Chinese communists have strengthened their hold by executing their opposition, people owning 2 or 3 acres of land who resisted communist collectivization and the breakup of their families. The dead, more than 20 million. The Russians call it liquidation. The Chinese call it seomei, which means deprived of existence. To grasp the meaning of this, we must transpose it closer to home. These executions would wipe out the entire population of these 13 states. One by one, the smaller nations of Southeast Asia have either fallen into the communist hands or have been very deeply penetrated by the fifth column. In Tibet, the Reds have murdered thousands and established a bloody reign of terror. It gives horrible evidence of the fate awaiting the remaining masses of Asia. The China victory paved the way for the next Red move from Manchuria into North Korea, where the communists infiltrated and quickly took over the government. Then, equipped with war material from Russia and communist China, the Reds moved down upon Syngman Rhee's little half-nation of South Korea. By almost any military or diplomatic measuring stick, the United States lost the Korean War. The American commanders who served in Korea during the actual fighting returned home crushed and bitter, and deeply disturbed. They were not permitted by our government to fight an all-out war for victory. Here is the testimony given under oath to congressional committees by our commanding generals in Korea. Mark Clark: "I was not allowed to bomb the numerous bridges that were across the Yalu River and over which the enemy constantly poured his trucks and his munitions and his killers." Stratemeyer: "You get in war to win it. You do not get in war to stand still and lose it. And we were required to lose it. We were not permitted to win." MacArthur: "Such a limitation upon the utilization of available military force to repel an enemy attack has no precedent either in our own history or, so far as I know, in the history of the world. It was a costly war. 54,246 Americans sacrificed their lives. There were 103,284 additional casualties. Becoming ever bolder in their seizure of power, the communists have moved into the Middle East, where they have established important beachheads, and on into the heartlands of the so-called Dark Continent of Africa. Here they are fomenting nationalistic revolts, gaining control of rebel forces, placing their agents in coalition governments. With much of the rest of the world either in their hands or easily within reach, the communists next set out to achieve the third step in Lenin's blueprint for world conquest, the encirclement of the United States. This required the establishment of Latin American bases. The Reds are today instigating student riots and governmental penetration in every South American nation. Much of their strength and most of their revolutionary activity in Latin America now originates in Cuba. So let's take a good look at how Cuba became the western base for the communist penetration of the Americans. Until he began to gain recognition and prestige in America, Fidel Castro commanded no real military forces. He did not pose a genuine threat to the anti-communist Cuban government. Then the buildup began. U.S. television networks sent camera crews into the Cuban mountains to bring back so-called documentary reports which pictured Castro as a romantic rebel, a Robin Hood leading a fight for social justice. They went out of their way to dispel the idea that Castro's movement had a communist complexion. Some of America's biggest newspapers joined in the buildup. This New York Times writer, Herbert Matthews, described him as the most remarkable and romantic figure to arise in Cuba since Jose Marti, hero of Cuba's Wars of Independence. Ed Sullivan presented Castro to his nationwide television audience. Sullivan said to Castro, "The people of the United States have great admiration for you and your men because you are in the real American tradition of George Washington." Sullivan much later retracted this statement. Qualified students of international communism were warning that Castro was himself a communist, or at least a long-time willing tool of world communism, and that many of the lieutenants surrounding him were known to be agents of international communism. Yet here the most widely circulated Catholic paper says, despite what you may have read, the Cuban rebels are not communists. There is absolutely no doubt about Fidel Castro. There is no communist indoctrination in the greatest degree of communist propaganda. The Christian Century is probably the most widely distributed Protestant publication in America. In this article, Wild Ducks from Cuba, Castro is pictured as a political liberal, an agrarian reformer, rather than a socialist or communist agent. The atmosphere in America became a pro-Castro atmosphere. The bearded Fidel began to get arms and to recruit a larger following. Left-wingers and even voices in the U.S. Congress demanded that the United States withdraw all aid to the anti-communist Batista government, as had happened to the anti-communist Chiang Kai-shek preceding the fall of China to the Reds. At a crucial time in the Cuban conflict, our government ordered an embargo. Castro's agents working openly in Florida were able to obtain great volumes of fighting equipment. On January 1st, 1959, the Cuban anti-communist government fell. Castro took over. The United States ambassadors to Cuba declared in sworn testimony that they warned the United States Department of State aiding Castro would bring about a great victory for international communism and a strategic defeat for the USA. Both men say their warnings were smothered in the State Department and in government circles under President Eisenhower. Since the fall of Cuba to the Reds, we have seen the communists demonstrate their power in Mexico, El Salvador, Ecuador, Guatemala, Venezuela, and other Latin American countries. The stronghold overflowing with armaments for the entire revolutionary conspiracy throughout Latin America is Cuba. With the takeover of Cuba, Lenin's heirs to the dictatorship of world communism thus had carried out, at least partially, the third phase in the Reds' blueprint for world conquest, the encirclement of the United States. Will the United States fall? What is the situation within our nation? This is San Francisco, USA. And these are American university students rioting against the House Committee on Un-American Activities. This is an official committee of our elected representatives in Congress. It has operated for 20 years as one of the nation's bulwarks, safeguarding our internal security against penetration of communist agents. J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, is one of the most highly respected Americans in the history of our republic. Mr. Hoover was so concerned with what happened in San Francisco that he issued this special report over his signature. In this report, Mr. Hoover carefully documents the fact that the Communist Party USA has as one of its chief objectives the destruction of the House Committee on Un-American Activities. Communists cannot themselves succeed in this target goal, thus they must deceive and agitate and use dupes. Mr. Hoover shows how known communist agents infiltrated campuses in the San Francisco area, promoting and inciting more than 1,000 students to riot against the House Committee, just as the Reds have been controlling and using university students to accomplish their objectives in nations throughout the world. FBI Director Hoover revealed that Gus Hall, national leader of the Communist Party of the USA, sent congratulations to the West Coast comrades for the initiative and leadership they displayed in all stages of the riotous demonstrations. In his report, Mr. Hoover issues a sober warning to the people of America. He says, looking at the riots and chaos communists have created in other countries, many Americans point to the strength of our nation and say, it can't happen here. The communist success in San Francisco in May 1960 proves that it can happen here. Yes, it has happened here. The communists, we now know, hold great power in proportion to their numbers here. They constitute a clear and present danger to our security, our lives. Many Americans have forgotten the penetration of our government by the communists, which were exposed by the FBI and the House Committee on Un-American Activities a decade ago. Alger Hiss, who had the confidence of an American president and access to vital secrets. Harry Dexter White, key man in the U.S. Treasury. Judith Copeland, working, amazingly enough, in the United States Justice Department itself. But what about the decade of the 1960s? What about now? Not long after the San Francisco student riots, 2 employees of the National Security Administration disappeared, Vernon Mitchell and William Martin. They turned up in Mexico, then Cuba, then Moscow. At first, the public was told these 2 men didn't have any important secrets, but soon the truth was exposed. They carried with them information of vital worth to the international communist conspiracy. The FBI has exposed the enemy at work in all areas of our national life, and congressional committees have documented the fact that communists have penetrated a number of strategic labor unions, communications networks, some areas of our educational establishment, and some church organizations, our industries, our government, our legislative halls, our armed services. They are dedicated, skilled, secretly working for the overthrow of our nation and the triumph of world communism. Early in 1961, Khrushchev told the communist leaders from throughout the world, as they gathered in Moscow for instructions in final strategy, that all-out military war would not be necessary. The victory of world communism is no longer far off, he said. Will this fantastic prediction come true? We are a nation of 180 million people, the vast majority of whom are almost totally uninformed or apathetic toward the true nature of our gravest problems. We have become a nation in which the responsibilities of citizenship are being ignored. We are encircled. The enemy is in our midst. As a nation, we have been backing away from the advances of international communism, accepting coexistence, summit conferences, coalition governments, negotiations, and disarmament conferences. But the communists continue advancing. Yes, the free world is losing. The communists are winning. But we can change this course of events. We can sidetrack and ultimately wreck the communist master plan for conquest if our people and our nation have the courage and the will, if we are worthy of freedom. Our greatest obstacle has been that so many Americans haven't known we were at war. because the war has been an insidious one, a protracted war with the enemy advancing just a little here and a little there. To halt the massive march of communism, millions of Americans must be awakened to the facts presented in this film. We must awaken a new pride in patriotism, pride in our nation's past and in its great destiny ahead. Love of country is one of mankind's highest virtues. We must recreate an effective legal safeguard enabling our government to stamp out the communist fifth column which has penetrated the vitals of our nation. We must stiffen our citizens and our nation's diplomatic attitude toward the whole communist international conspiracy and the brutal despots who are leading it. We must arouse our friends and neighbors to a better understanding of the dangers inherent in the further centralization of our government. We must look with clear eyes at the true fact of our moral weakening, and in our homes, our churches, and our schools, build the caliber of moral leadership that a free people must achieve to remain free. It is too late for continued apathy. The time has come for sacrifices in the cause of freedom by informed and determined citizens. In this great moment in human history, will you enlist and pledge a part of your mental, physical, material, and spiritual resources in this fight? This is the decisive question. On the manner in which Americans respond to this challenge rests the future hope of all free men.